Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Hollywood. I'm the Associate Director here at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. Thank you so much for joining us here today as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. So first, I just want to make a few acknowledgments. Thank you to Queensborough Community College for supporting this and all of our programs, projects, and exhibitions, especially our new interim president, Dr. Timothy Lynch, and Vice President for Institutional Advancement, Ms. Rosemary Sullivan-Zins. Also, thank you to Dr. Bibi Bernsteins for supporting this and all events in this year's Drs. Bibi and Owen Bernstein Lecture Series. We're grateful for her ongoing support of our public programs. I'd also like to thank the many people who volunteer their time here at the KHC. There are so many people that help us in the office, our library, who serve as interns and fellows, survivors who come in and share their stories with our students, and we're so grateful for all of you. You make the center run. And I'd particularly like to recognize the Khc Advisory Board. I know I saw a few members of it. Would you please stand and be recognized? We really appreciate you serving on that board. Thank you. Abe and Barbara, thank you so much. I would also like to recognize the members of our Dr. Sandra Delson Community Engagement Team, our volunteer docents. We launched this program in 2017 to train local community members who were interested in helping us support our mission to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of unbridled prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Docents receive intensive training about the Holocaust, genocide, human rights, as well as the history of the center in order to lead exhibition tours and informational sessions to students, community groups, and general visitors to the center. This project was a creation of Dr. Sandy Delson, a longtime supporter of the KHC, as well as Queensborough Community College. As many of you may know, Sandy passed away earlier this year after a battle with cancer. She's greatly missed, but we feel so honored that we can support her legacy through the community engagement team. We currently have 17 trained docents leading tours, and I know I saw a number of you here today. Would you also stand and be recognized? We appreciate all of the time that you spend here. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, one last thank you to our amazing administrative staff. As you know, we've been without an executive director now for about 7 months, and I'm very proud to say we've been able to maintain all of our program and fundraising goals so far. And I would not have been able to do that without the hard work of Ms. Victoria Fernandez and Mr. Joel George at the back of the room. Thank you both for being so passionate about the work that we do here. Okay, and now our program. Violent anti-Jewish attacks. Synagogues becoming a target for violence rather than a sacred safe space. How can it be that we speak of news in the events in the news today that are no different from those that took place 80 years ago? The tragic attack on the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh last month reminds us that the world has still not learned the lessons of the Holocaust, and that even small acts of hate can lead to genocide. As communities gather together these last few days to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, the Night of the Broken Glass, we are reminded that it is more important than ever to keep educating about the dangers of anti-Semitism, hatred, and disrespect. Today, we will add a new component to our regularly scheduled program, some activities to honor the 11 Pittsburgh shooting victims, a painful reminder that anti-Semitism still exists 80 years later. In tribute to these tragic events, I will read the names and the ages of the 11 victims, and then we will light a candle that will burn through our program. Joyce Feinberg, 75. Richard Gottfried, 65. Rose Mallinger, 97. Jerry Rabinowitz, 66. Cecile Rosenthal, 59. David Rosenthal, 54, brother of Cecile. Bernice Simon, 84. Sylvan Simon, 86, husband of Bernice. Daniel Stein, 71. Melvin Wax, 88. Irving Younger, 69. You will not be forgotten. You did not die in vain. Please join me for a moment of silence as we commemorate these 11 victims, the 300+ people that were killed during the Kristallnacht pogrom, and the 6 million who perished during the Holocaust. I'm honored and privileged to introduce our first speaker, Holocaust survivor Johanna, or Hanny, as we call her here, Liebman, who will share her memories about being a teenager in Germany on those dreadful days in 1938. More details of her story can be found in our current exhibition that's on display, Conspiracy of Goodness. Hanny is an amazing woman and probably one of the toughest people I have ever met. I love to tell the story about how I was 8 months pregnant and I was trying to move a table in our classroom, and Hanny walked in and yelled at me and then moved me aside, and she herself moved the table. Working here and talking about the Holocaust and hate crimes and so many other painful and disturbing topics, it's very emotionally draining, as you can imagine. But being around Hanny and so many of our other wonderful survivors, it truly gives me hope and it inspires me to go on. So please join me in welcoming Hanne Liebmann.
Good afternoon. Let me explain how Kristallnacht came about, or the excuse for it. In the fall of 1938, Jewish people of Polish background were expelled from Germany. They were sitting in no man's land for some time because Germany expelled them. Poland didn't want to take them back. It was a very miserable situation. Among the people was a couple by the name of Grünspan. Their son, a teenager, was studying in Paris. He became enraged over what happened to his parents and to the other Jewish people of Polish background. And he decided that he is going to get a gun and shoot the German ambassador in Paris. And indeed, he went to the embassy, and he did not kill the ambassador because he couldn't find him, but he killed a young man, Ernest Fromrath, a secretary of the legation. That was on the 7th of November, 1938. The young man died on the 9th of November, 1938. And this was the excuse of a long-planned attack on the Jewish people in Germany. And so I will read to you the orders that went out during the night of November 9 to 10 from the government, if you wish. Measures against Jews tonight. Following the attempt on the life of Secretary of the Legation Fromrath in Paris, demonstrations against the Jews are to be expected in all parts of the Reich in the course of the coming night, November 9-10, 1938. The instructions below are to be applied in dealing with these events. The chiefs of the state police or their deputies must immediately, upon receipt of this telegram, contact by telephone the political leaders in their areas, Gauleiters or Kreisleiters who have jurisdiction in their districts, and arrange a joint meeting with the inspector or commander of the order police to discuss the arrangements for the demonstrations. Excuse me. At these discussions, the political leaders will be informed that the German police has received instruction detailed below from the Reichsführer SS and the German police, with which the political leadership is requested to coordinate its own measures. A, only such measures are to be taken as do not endanger German lives or property. Synagogues are to be burned down only where there is no danger of fire in neighboring buildings. Places of business and apartments belonging to to Jews may be destroyed but not looted. The police is instructed to supervise the observance of this order and to arrest looters. In commercial streets, particular care is to be taken that non-Jewish businesses are completely protected against damage. Foreign citizens, even if they are Jews, are not to be molested. On the assumption that the guidelines details under paragraph 1 are observed, the demonstrations are not to be prevented by the police, which is only to supervise the observance of guidelines. On receipt of this telegram, police will seize all archives to be found in all synagogues and offices of the Jewish community, so as to prevent their destruction during the demonstration. This refers only to material of historical value, not of contemporary tax records, etc. The archives are to be handed over to the locally responsible officers of the SD, which was, anyway. The control of the measures of the security police concerning the demonstration against the Jews is vested in the organs of the state police, unless inspectors of the security police have given their own instructions. Officials of the criminal police, member of the SD, of the reserves and the SS in general, may be used to carry out the measures taken by the security police. As soon as the course of events during the night permits the release of the officials required, as many Jews in all districts, especially the rich, as can be accommodated in existing prisons, are to be arrested. For the time being, only healthy male Jews who are not too old are to be detained. After detentions have been carried out, the appropriate concentration camps are to be contacted immediately for the prompt accommodation of the Jews in the camps. Special care is to be taken that the Jews arrested in accordance with this instruction are not ill-treated. Signed, SS Heydrich, okay? 30,000 Jewish men were arrested. 100 died these days. They are not to be hurt. They were beaten. Some were beaten to death. I had someone in my family was arrested and severely beaten, and because he had an American visa in his pocket, he got out of the camp very quickly. When he came here, he first had to be taken care of by Mount Sinai Hospital because he had a broken clavicle and a broken shoulder. Same person who served in the First World War, as did many of the men who were arrested. Now, my family, we knew nothing about it. I went to school that morning, November 10th, Jewish school, because we had already been segregated out of public schools. It was a secular school, okay? On my way to school, I saw a fire engine standing in front of a building. You could not see the synagogue that was in the back of this particular building. It was an Orthodox synagogue, it was a very nice synagogue. And I wondered, why is the fire engine standing there? I came into my classroom, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was kind of a noisy kid, sort of came in the classroom and said, I don't know. I saw the fire engine standing in front of the building of the synagogue. I didn't see any fire. And I looked at my friends, and they were sitting there, tears running down their cheeks. Don't you know? I said, no, what? our fathers have been arrested and taken away. Well, none of the male teachers were in school, that's for sure. They had been arrested. So we only had 2 ladies to take care of 8 grades. Right. So one of them, and I never liked her, came into the classroom. Now she has to keep the kids busy, right? Well, write a composition, if you wish, about your summer vacation. You are laughing, and you're right. So I started, and after 3 sentences, I closed my book and said, what a ridiculous idea. Said, we should write today, when this is going on, a composition about our summer vacation. When, in Germany, no Jew could go to a swimming pool, to the beach on the Rhine River where we lived, couldn't go to anywhere. Not to a restaurant, not to, well, we didn't have diners. Whatever it was, we couldn't go. Not a movie, not a theater, not an opera, nothing. So what vacation could we have had? Right? Sit at home. That's what the vacation was. So I closed my book. That was it. I don't know what the others did. 10 o'clock, we were dismissed. And on my way home, I saw what happened. We happened to live on the main street of town. We had a photo studio. And as I approached the house we lived and had our business, I saw my mother in the middle of the sidewalk, sweeping up the glass from our showcases, with a whole bunch of people around her. I went to my mother and said, I will do it. I will sweep up the sidewalk. And she said, no, you go upstairs, because she was afraid for me. It was dangerous for her, but she wanted to make sure I'm not being molested in any way. Next to us was a store that sold, a Jewish store that sold Oriental carpeting. The windows were smashed in, and the carpets were doused with ink. That made that they were worthless, because that you cannot get out. It was horrible, and that's an understatement. I went upstairs, and it was a horribly sad, upsetting, frightening day. And after some time, when things had calmed down a bit, what happened? I don't remember. We went back to school. We tried to live a fairly normal life, if this was possible. We were deprived of all incomes. Every Jewish business had to be closed, no more income. Okay? The men slowly came back from the concentration camps. And we lived as best we could. And that wasn't saying much. And what was the upshot of it all? Now you have damages to your business, the glass, the merchandise, what have you. So the insurance should make good on it, right? The Germans decided differently. The Jewish community in Germany had to raise 1 billion marks for the damages they had created. So we have to pay for the damages that were done to us. The Jewish community in Germany was no longer a well-to-do community because too many people could no longer work. The ground of the synagogue I belonged to, the Reformed synagogue was torn down. The real estate was sold rather quickly. And the money was used to feed the members of the community who could no longer feed themselves. There was a soup kitchen where people could go and get a meal. So then came the war, of course, and things got even worse. No telephone, no radio, curfews, smaller rations, and so on. So this is the way I remember November 10, 1938. I thank you for listening.
Minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Hanny about her experience? Would you mind taking a few questions? Would you mind a few questions?
No,
okay.
Of course not.
Please.
Yes, what was it like back in the day when the attack happened?
She asked, what was it like when the attack happened? What was it like when the attack happened?
What was it like?
Yeah.
Frightening, to say the least. Imagine my mother standing in the street, sweeping up the shards from our showcases, right? Surrounded by hostile people, how she must have felt. My mother never swept the sidewalk before, I assure you.
And they owned your mom owned a photography studio?
Yeah. The only reason they did not come into our apartment and the business was the fact that my father died in 1925 and there was no man to be arrested. So, at least that much.
I'm going to take the mic to some questions over there.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us of important things. My question is this: for some of us, I have acquired similar background, as you know. We are used now to thinking of these events in retrospect. Could you further describe, please, the reactions and what people took from that event, that day, or that week, at that time, the perspective without benefit of hindsight?
What they took away from this event, that most of them finally realized that no Jew could stay in Germany. All these years, oh, that will pass, that cannot last, that will blah, blah, blah. Finally, the realization came that we have to get out.
Thank you.
Yes, hello, and thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering, there was about a 10-month period between the time that Kristallnacht occurred and the time that Germany attacked Poland, and maybe that was viewed as the real opening shot for World War II. But in that 10-month interval, what actually was the situation? Were there any further events, anything like Kristallnacht, or what was it like there?
After the war started, after Germany walked into Poland, yeah, curfews, as I mentioned, telephones were taken away from us. And for you people who pay your telephone bill to the telephone company, in Germany the telephone was run through the postal services. So they knew exactly who had a telephone. So they came and took it away from you. Radio taken away. Our lives became very, how should I explain it? Narrow, right? In many of the cities, Jews could only go shopping at certain hours. And in Berlin, in one of the big department stores that was once Jewish, and you might remember, loudspeakers went on and saying, it is now such and such an hour, all Jews have to leave. Remember, that used to be a Jewish department store.
Yes.
I wondered when you and your family, or your mother, I guess, left, when you were able to leave Germany.
We were not able to get out of Germany. I was not lucky enough to go on the Kindertransport, where 10,000 Jewish children went to England, and maybe we even have some people who were lucky enough. Anyway, life became extremely difficult. And with no income, you had to be very careful with your means. So that made things even more complicated, right? One of the things that my family did is, since we had a large apartment, and my mother had 3 sisters who also had a very large apartment, we combined, as well as my paternal grandmother lived with us. So it's cheaper to pay 1 rent over 3 rents. So you had to do things like that. And in many of the houses, Jewish people could not stay. They were told to get out. And so many Jewish people or families doubled up, even if they didn't, weren't related or anything like that.
Great. Oh, Anita?
In most small towns, the Jews were told to leave. I'm from Vienna, Austria. So the Jews came to Vienna, and the Jewish community had to take them in. As Hanne said, there was no income. Business was taken away. So taking the people in, you got a little money. This was how you could survive. At the same time, help the Jews to stay. Now, you asked the questions why the people didn't leave. To be able to leave, you needed a country who was willing to take you. And unfortunately, the world was quiet. Right after Kristallnacht, Hitler waited. How will the world react to what he did? The world was quiet. So Hitler knew he can do what he wants to do, and he surely did it. It was very difficult to be able to leave. For America, you had a quota system, and most countries didn't want the Jews.
Thanks so much, Anita. So Anita is a survivor of the Kindertransport, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but on December 5th, we will have a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransports, where Ms. Weisberg will speak. Okay, we'll take one more question.
I'd like to say, quite a while ago, I read a book called The Transfer Agreement, written by Edwin Black. Edwin Black has written many books regarding the time that, this horrible time, because his parents were part of it. He wrote the book called IBM and the Holocaust. I don't know if many people are aware that some of the American companies were working in conjunction with the Germans. More than that, there was, I don't know when it occurred, but I believe that Hitler and his group of people called something called the Transfer Agreement, where they agreed to send Jews to other countries, including Israel, and nobody wanted to take the Jews in. He wanted to get rid of the Jews. When he saw that nobody wanted them, then he started to, I believe, go on this stupid and horrible endeavor that we lost all our people. But I want to relate to today, where we're living today. Where are we? What have we learned from what you people have gone through? Should we be afraid and do something, or what? I don't know who we can look up to. We have a president that seems to be good for the Jewish people. And when I read and I saw something when he tried to spend a little time in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, regarding those people that were lost, I was very ashamed of our own people, the way they treated our president. I'm hoping that We never have to go through anything like this, but we can't be quiet. We have to raise our voices up. Thank you.
How can I answer you? I agree that we have to do something. It is a shame that we are talking of not letting the people in who look for refuge and for a little bit of better life than what they had. It's an old story. We know when we needed to leave Germany, there were immense obstacles. Australia, we don't want any part of that Jewish question. Eventually, they only took people with certain professions. America, you had to get an affidavit. Well, who is going to give you an affidavit, right? If you had family who could do it, fine and good. If you found maybe someone, a stranger, like my husband and I, fine. But otherwise, forget it. You will remember the meeting of 32 nations, right? What to do about the Jewish problem? What was the end result? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And when I hear today, we can't let these people in, they're all murderers and criminals. No way. It is a shame. My husband and I were very lucky. It is true that we were deported on October 22nd, 1940, by the Germans to France. Not east, west. The French, not knowing whom we were, and they weren't told, put us in a concentration camp called Gurs. I was there 11 months. My husband was there 22 months. As a matter of fact, I met him there. Oh, we met. And I was extremely lucky, and so was he, that in the camp, now France is different from Germany, some social services could function, and their aim was to get children and young people out of the camp. And I was one who was picked, and I came to a village called Les Chambons, which took us in, no questions asked. They were the most fantastic people, right? And look at the exhibit we have here, and then you will realize what these people did and risked their lives for us. And I was eventually hidden on a farm, and the police came and asked the farmers, "Are you hiding any Jews?" 2 Jewish girls are upstairs. They can hear it in their hiding place. And this nice French farmer who took us in and his wife told the police, "I don't know what Jews look like, but would you really care for a glass of red wine?" We stand there in our hiding place with our hearts beating, and how long is that going to take? And eventually he said, "No, thank you, I'm on my way." Many of the people who were in Les Chambons got, or most of them got false papers, and you can find false papers there. And eventually, if you had enough guts, you made your way into Switzerland. You were lucky if they let you in. My husband took that route, and he was caught and was told to go back into France together with some other people that were caught that day, up in the mountains, way above the tree line. And he disobeyed orders. And when most of them had gone back, he went the other way into Switzerland. 28,000 people, refugees, were in Switzerland. If there were some complaints, well, some were justified, some were not. I think most people were glad to be safe, to have a bed to sleep in, a blanket to cover themselves, and whatever. Could have Switzerland taken in more refugees? I believe so. 28,000 people is not a lot of people for a whole country, even if it's a small country. And it is small. So we were the lucky ones. Lucky that we were taken out of the camp. Lucky that we came to a place like Le Chambon. And lucky that we made it into Switzerland. And if we went back to Le Chambon quite a few times, and then you said, well, we thank you for what you did, and so on and so forth, the answer was always from everyone, we didn't do anything, only risk their own lives. We didn't do anything, nothing to talk about.
We're going to move on with the program, but we'll take more questions at the end. So our keynote presentation today is by Dr. Azadah Aalai, Queensborough Community College psychology professor, who will speak about bystander behavior during the Holocaust and the factors for the choices people made over whether to help their Jewish neighbors or be complicit with the actions of the Nazis. Dr. Aalai served as the 2017-2018 Khc NEH Scholar-in-Residence. It's been such an honor working with her over the last year. I think she enjoyed it too because she still keeps coming back. And I'm very excited to hear the findings of her research. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Aalai.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's nice to see familiar faces from when I was a scholar in residency here, and some new faces as well. Welcome. As Marissa mentioned, they just can't get rid of me. I'm always here, which is really nice. I could have just sat and listened to Hannah the entire time, so thank you for that wonderful description. I'm actually going to be expanding on a lot. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? I'm naturally loud as a professor, so I'm always a little bit caught off guard when there's a microphone in front of me. Okay, so my work as a social psychologist, I started out looking at Holocaust-related behavior from the perspective of perpetrators. So I started my research looking at what are the psychological mechanisms that enable perpetrators to engage in the type of atrocities that were mentioned. As my work evolved, I became less interested in perpetrator behavior and more interested in bystander behavior. The reasons for this are manifold. Perhaps most significantly, it's marked by the fact that bystanders far outnumbered both perpetrators and victims, and the grim reality that the totality of the Holocaust would not have been able to have existed without minimally bystander indifference, and in many cases, their active collaboration. I'm going to talk about the language we use regarding bystander behavior shortly, and as I mentioned, as a social psychologist, I'll really focus on, from a scholarship perspective, what do we have to add to the conversation? But first, I just want to elaborate and build a little bit on the talk that was already given about the significance of the Night of Broken Glass. You know, a lot of times when we think about the Holocaust, as the gentleman who had that comment mentions, we think about it obviously in retrospect now, and we also think about it in terms of the mass killings and then the aftermath. And we fail to recognize how many opportunities there might have been to stop the course of history, to save many, many more lives, for instance, or even to stop the escalation to mass murder that eventually occurred. And so an important point to identify is that genocide is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, And there are so many stages within that process. You know, today, genocide scholars, they talk about 8 specific steps to genocide, for instance. The killing behaviors is one of the second to last steps. So there's so many things that have to happen before you see the level of mass scale murdering and execution that ultimately culminated in the Holocaust. As social psychologists, we use this term continuum of destruction to really encompass what that process is for genocide. Continuum of destruction, essentially what that means is that you have smaller scale acts of discrimination and persecution against the target group, and then they escalate. It's a step-by-step escalation that eventually culminates in the level of atrocity that you see during genocide, and specifically during the Holocaust. As the regime moves further and further along this continuum of destruction, the policy becomes more radicalized against the target group, and the level of discrimination becomes more violent. And it's within this context that the role of bystanders becomes very, very critical. In fact, social scientists, we've identified that early on, before persecution is to that level of violence, bystanders are actually the best hope for combating the genocidal policies, for either resisting or preventing the escalation to mass murder. But in order to effectively counter such policies, bystanders have to be active, they have to engage in resistance, they have to speak out, they have to be active members of their communities. And unfortunately, as was identified, and I'll elaborate on this, that generally does not happen. You know, rescue and resistance, like what happens in Les Chambon that was mentioned and that we have in this exhibit, unfortunately, that's within the minority. And I'll talk about why that is shortly as well. Let me just also mention, as Hanne mentioned, that Kristallnacht was not spontaneous, as we're oftentimes led to believe. She did a beautiful job of reading the actual orders that were handed down. So it was a very, very coordinated attack. You know, a lot of the descriptions we see harassment, brutalization, humiliation of the Jewish people, you know, mass atrocities and violence. Over 1,100 synagogues were destroyed, significantly larger numbers than were originally reported. It was mentioned, you know, the 100+ males who were imprisoned, over 300 ends up being killed. And just to give a sense of historical context, as was mentioned, policies were already being implemented that were stripping the Jewish people of their basic rights in both Germany and eventually Nazi-occupied Austria. The Nuremberg Laws came into effect in 1935, which took away a lot of rights and specifically started to institutionalize and legitimize discrimination against the Jewish people so that it's now legally part of Nazi policy. What you see is that this process of Aryanization, it's complete in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. And you see the stripping of businesses, as was mentioned, professional status was stripped, the brute violence that was waged, and also the way that they were then they had that financial burden, which is obviously outrageous, of then having to pay for all the destruction that they themselves, of course, were victims of. So this is also really the first time in full view violence against the Jewish people was waged, and it was being publicized. So I'm going to talk about the American response that was hinted at, for instance, and then the response within Germany and Austria as well. So let me just give the language of bystander behavior, and then I'll return to the American response. The same way there's a continuum of destruction and genocide as a process, there's also a continuum for bystander behavior. When I was scholar-in-residence, the specific theme that I explored was complicity and collaboration. So I want to explain for those of you who might not be aware of the language what this means. When you think about bystander behavior, you can similarly think of a continuum. Complicity is basically not doing anything. It's passivity. If you're complicit, you're basically ignoring what's happening. You're turning a blind eye. You're not doing anything to actively help the regime, but you're also not doing anything to stop it. So you're an eyewitness, you're there, or you're part of the international community, as America was, and you're observing things, and you're just not doing anything. It's passivity. And I always think of, there's this great quote by a rabbi I encountered where he said, "Not everyone is guilty, but everyone is responsible." So this sense of complicity, yeah, you could argue, well, I'm not a perpetrator and I'm not helping the regime, but at the same time, you're not doing anything to stop what's happening either. So there's passivity, there's non-action. Collaboration is further escalation on that continuum of bystander behavior. Collaboration is actively aiding the genocidal regime. It's essentially facilitating or enabling the persecution of the Jewish people. And oftentimes, the language that scholars use today oftentimes is beneficiaries. So a lot of individuals who engaged in collaboration, it was self-interest driven. They had something to gain, whether it was Jewish-run businesses, whether it was property, for instance. There was something tangible that collaborators could benefit from. Maybe it was even just being within the good graces of local Nazi officials because you were ratting out neighbors or things like that. But the point of collaboration is actually, once bystander behavior escalates to collaboration, there's a graying of the lines between perpetrators and bystanders. Because now your behavior in many ways is similar to what the perpetrators are engaging in. You're actively cooperating with a regime that's setting out to destroy these people. So it very much blurs the lines there. The other side of the coin, unfortunately, which again is in the minority, is rescue and resistance. And that is also a continuum. You know, a lot of times rescue could just start with offering shelter, offering help to a fellow neighbor, for instance, and then that investment can escalate to offering shelter for other people, for instance. I know someone that can, forge false documents, for instance, and before you know it, you become a haven for people in need of help, for instance. So we had, especially with the Conspiracy of Goodness exhibit, we've had a lot of events where we've talked about that rescue and resistance side of the coin. And one of the terms that I encountered that I really liked was simplicity of goodness. So small acts of kindness can similarly escalate to larger and larger acts of rescue. And then before you know it, you're a village like Le Chambon, which over the course of the war ended up rescuing upwards of 5,000 refugees who passed through their territory. So, are you all familiar with the term banality of evil that came out in the aftermath of the Holocaust, right? This notion of, a lot of times we think of evil as being this demonic or monstrous kind of behavior that's really extraordinary. But in fact, evil can be really ordinary. Complicity is evil through non-action, for instance. So in the same way that evil can be ordinary, the simplicity of goodness also identifies and demonstrates that you don't necessarily set out to be a hero when you engage in acts of resistance or rescue. You're just being decent towards your fellow human beings, to your fellow neighbors, regardless of what their background is, regardless of what group that they're from. And that's generally when you read rescuers, their descriptions are very similar to what Hanne described about Le Chambon. I didn't do anything special. I just did what everyone would have done in my place. I offered them a safe place to sleep. I offered them food when they needed it. We offered whatever we were able to do. But of course, we know that those measures, in fact, do end up being really heroic because they're outside of what the majority of people ended up doing during that time period. So let me go back to the American response. And the reason why I want to focus for a moment on America is because when we look at bystanders, there's different ways that we can think about bystanders. You have external bystanders that are outside of Germany and Nazi-occupied territories. So you can think of the international community outside of the immediate areas of conflict as the external bystanders. And then I'll end with a discussion of internal bystanders. But the United States arguably was one of the most influential leaders in terms of international community response. And for the first time since the Nazis came into power, the Night of Broken Glass really put on public display the extent of Nazi brutality against the Jewish people. It could not be denied, it could not be justified, and it was very much reported by the American press. Absolutely reported here in the States. And you want to also consider historically, Hitler had also had the kind of triumph, if you will, of the Olympic Games earlier. So the Nazi regime, from the United States perspective, had accumulated a lot of powerful positive press during the Berlin Games. So this becomes even more outrageous in terms of kind of contrary to that carefully cultivated Nazi image that they were trying to present to the international community and American public in particular. The American press across the board widely condemned German acts in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. Even publications here in the States which had previously shown sympathy for Germany and their quote-unquote refugee Jewish problem could not deny the extent of the brutalities. But unfortunately, the reports by the American media were incomplete. They failed to link the violence to anti-Semitism and instead saw it as an opportunity to extort Jews financially. So there was this kind of dismissal or failure to really connect Kristallnacht specifically to anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, that blind spot continues to present day when Jewish people here in the States today are specifically attacked. In the aftermath, for instance, of the Pittsburgh attacks, the current administration talked about an attack on religion as if in general religion is under attack here in America, and failed to specifically identify, well, it wasn't religion specifically, it was Jewish religion that was under attack. So this is a common theme that we see historically regarding the kind of, some scholars refer to it as a universalizing of victims when they're Jewish, and failing to recognize that why they're being victimized is very specific to Jewish identity. That in itself is a form of anti-Semitism as well. So that was part of the press reaction, is it's kind of like, well, the Nazis are treating everyone bad, and this is just another group that's now being extorted. So this failure, and this was a consistent failure throughout the Holocaust, unfortunately, the American press consistently failed to identify that anti-Semitism was not a fringe part of Nazi ideology, it was a central tenet of Nazi ideology. And the Night of Broken Glass was just the most public, up until that point, demonstration of this rampant Nazi anti-Semitism. So that was one of the blind spots regarding the reports by the American press. But there was widespread condemnation in the aftermath of this event. So then the bigger question became, how would President Roosevelt and his administration respond in the aftermath of press reports of Kristallnacht? The response was Roosevelt recalled the ambassador of Germany. And that was it. That was it. It was a relatively weak response. There was a symbolic rebuke of Nazi actions. Clearly, America disapproved, but it did not go any farther. They didn't alter their refugee policy. As was mentioned, the quotas were still in place. There are two primary reasons for this weak response. And again, we'll notice parallels between then and today. The press, at the same time that they were reporting on Kristallnacht, they were also cautioning against, quote unquote, getting involved in European entanglements. So there was isolationism. That was the official policy, not just of the government, not just of the press, but the American people. The public did not want to get entangled in foreign policy abroad. Secondly, there was this sense of we're struggling with employment, we're struggling socially in America, and we can't open our borders to other groups, that it's, you know, tragic potentially what's happening, but it's not in our backyard, it's not our problem. So there was this very, very anti-immigration stance during that time period, where immigrants were seen, and particularly Jewish people seeking refuge, were seen as threatening to an already struggling status quo here in America. In fact, polls taken in November, shortly after Kristallnacht was reported by the press, revealed that Americans remained adamantly opposed to any changes in refugee legislation. Similarly, Gallup polls around the same time in November indicate that most Americans regarded maintaining neutrality as the most important issue facing them at that time period. So these were the two primary underlying ideologies here in America that led to the non-response in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. So taken together, the international community, external bystanders, to the extent that we can say the US remained a leader, was clearly not going to intervene and save the European Jews. In fact, former president and overseer of refugee rescue and aid during World War I, Hoover, reportedly at that time was quoted as saying, "America cannot open its doors in the face of our own unemployment and suffering. Sanctuary must be found elsewhere." And unfortunately, some version of that value would persist even as Nazi brutality would become worse and worse, and eventually the quote-unquote final solution would be executed. So we can't rely on external bystanders. We couldn't back then. So then the role of bystanders within the countries where persecutions are taking place is so critical. They have the best chance of reversing the course of action by the regime if they mount protest, if they resist, if they speak out. But unfortunately, as we know, and as was very eloquently described, a lot of these attacks were happening in full view of eyewitnesses who were doing nothing to stop them. Many of them, you know, when you look at the footage, it's so distressing, they almost feel, it feels as if they're even amused or entertained. In the aftermath, when you see the Jewish business owners attempting to clean up the glass and things like that, you see these really harrowing images. Women in their fur coats just standing out there as if it's a spectacle of entertainment to watch in the aftermath. So the question becomes why? And this is really where you get into the psychology of bystander behavior. You know, as was mentioned, the Jews had significantly already been separated from German society and within Austria once the Nazis invaded. So you get this in-group, out-group division. And then what ends up happening is that out-group is demonized. They're presented as other, and their value is diminished within the society. They're separated from our regular in-group, from our regular consideration, and so what happens to them is no longer my problem. So unfortunately, that's a big part of it. Obviously, stereotypes play a big role in promoting this, so you have really negative depictions, you know, very extensive propaganda against the Jewish people almost immediately when Hitler rises to power. So anti-Semitism plays a significant role here. You also see a lack of empathy that's really significant for bystanders. If I want to help a stranger in need, I need to a certain extent, be able to relate to that person's predicament or have some sense of compassion for that individual. And so the diminishment of empathy very significantly is going to undermine the likelihood that I'm going to help this group. We've actually coined this term in social psychology that's referred to as the collapse of compassion. Actually, Stalin has this great quote that really demonstrates what the collapse of compassion is. So Stalin is quoted as saying, "The death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic." So the collapse of compassion is really perverse, but essentially, the larger the group in need actually is, the less empathy they solicit from individuals. Because there's this sense of the group becomes this uniform whole with no distinguishing characteristics, and I'm not able to kind of connect interpersonally or relate to that group that's being victimized. This might also explain why generally bystanders would not offer help, but if a specific person came up to a neighbor asking for help, it's harder to refuse. So there is something in our psychology where we are capable, and I would argue even wired more towards compassion than not, even though that seems very contrary to our human nature when we talk about things like the Holocaust. But, you know, the problem is that when you have this massive propaganda campaign that's presenting the Jewish people as this homogeneous group, that with no redeeming characters, that are separated or distinct from the rest of our society, then that really incites that likelihood of collapse of compassion. Then that really undermines my ability as a community member to feel any sense of empathy for them. And the collapse of compassion is also a defense mechanism, because we can feel overwhelmed by all the people in need. We can feel psychologically distressed by that, and we want to shut that down. And we've actually demonstrated in laboratory settings that participants a lot of times will purposely engage in this collapse of compassion because they don't emotionally want to feel compelled to help other people, that this takes a psychological toll on us. A lot of times too, once that out-group has been demonized, we have selective empathy where I feel regard for my own people if I see that they're being persecuted by the Nazis, but I don't necessarily extend that to other people. So that in-group, out-group division is really critical. That really goes a long way towards detaching from how I see that group being treated. This is very similar to what Hanne identified in terms of making the Jewish people themselves pay the fines for destruction that was leveled at them as victims. But this also commonly happens. The victim ends up being blamed for their own victimization. This very, very commonly happens. And so what that ends up doing is it justifies why this group is being targeted. So Austrian radio at that time, for instance, as they were reporting on the brutality of the Night of Broken Glass, you see transcripts where they're saying things, quote unquote, like Jews have only themselves to blame. So this sense of they've done something to incite this violence against them. Blame the victim is very, very powerful, because also when you see that no one around this group is helping them, that further justifies why they're not being helped. Well, there must be a reason why their neighbors aren't doing anything. There must be a reason why this regime is targeting them. We don't know the full story. So you get that kind of justification as well. Unfortunately, what you also saw during that time period, there was a lack of leadership. Religious leaders remained largely silent in terms of condemning what was happening. Obviously, I identified the relative weakness of the American response, and a lot of times, in terms of the international community, how America responds then serves as the kind of template, if you will, for how other countries respond. So their non-intervention justifies non-intervention by other countries as well. And as was also mentioned, the Night of Broken Glass was really like a testing ground for the Nazi regime. There's this sense of we're going to see what we can get away with. And because there was such a non-reaction, especially by the international community, then you see that the reaction of the regime becomes more and more radicalized because they see they're getting away with it. If you look at the memoirs of people in Hitler's inner circle, you read things like, we're just doing what other countries wanted to do to the Jews, but that didn't have the courage to implement. So what happens with complicity, that passivity is interpreted by the perpetrators as tacit approval of their policies. That's why it's so powerful, because there's this sense of they're all okay with what we're doing, because if they weren't, they would be doing something to stop us. And what ends up happening on that continuum of destruction, which I think we really need to be sensitive to as Americans today, is as the process of genocide unfolds, social norms change within the society, and behaviors that previously would have been unheard of or unacceptable all of a sudden become permissible or in the range of what we would approve of. So that's really, really critical as well. And as that process of genocide unfolds, bystanders and perpetrators, but since I'm focusing on bystanders, bystanders become increasingly desensitized to the plight of whatever groups are being persecuted. Desensitization, it means exactly what it sounds like. We become numb to the suffering of these other groups. We become accustomed to it. You know, even if you read State Department reactions and American responses, a lot of them are like, we're tired of hearing the Jews whining about this. So you also see that desensitized response among policymakers here, among the press here, in terms of what they chose to report on versus what they ignored when they were reporting on Nazi atrocities. Unfortunately, there was clearly a lack of political will in terms of this lack of leadership. And so that was a big part of it as well. I wanted to leave some time for questions. So I'm gonna complete my discussion, but I'm happy to elaborate on anything that you would like me to in terms of my questions. Thank you for listening, everyone. This one, you can take this one if you want. I'm pretty loud. Yeah, I'm pretty loud. Okay. Because I know we missed you before.
Wow, that was some presentation. It was remarkable. There's so much that's running through my mind now. Although someone unfortunately has thrown out some politicalization today, which I think was unfortunate, but in listening to your speaking, at least I can't, and I'm sure many other people, pick up vibes of what's going on right now in our country, unfortunately with our leadership, particularly with the immigration situation. It seems as though you're explaining the contemporary situation that's going on right now. A couple of points. The analysis was on the ball and perfect, but what do we do with that analysis to make use of it? And the third thing, to emphasize one of your points about what was going on in the 30s. This was either from yesterday or Friday's Times, and it was a comment on something that means a lot more to people of my generation than yours. And what was that? It was the song, God Bless America. And I was astounded, because as I grew up, that was a real big thing. And there was a controversy about it because it was written by a Jew. And people didn't like that. One of the members somebody made this statement: if Franklin Roosevelt, meaning Roosevelt, takes the place of George Washington, so in the cultural life, Beethoven is being replaced by Irving Berlin and the like. This is what was going on in the 1930s. There was a group called the Pro-Nazi Protestant War Veterans of the United States. And they also were very upset about God Bless America having been written by a Jew and getting such acclamation. Those are some of the things that ran through my mind as you were speaking.
Oh, is it working? Yeah. Thank you. Let me comment on a couple of your remarks. It's a question that I get a lot when I do these kinds of talks, is what can we do today? And unfortunately, I'm really ill-equipped to answer that. There's a huge disconnect a lot of times between scholarship and what work academics are doing and kind of public policy and prescribing what can be done. What I can say is that I think it's really important to have events like this. I think it's really important to have these kinds of discussions. Obviously, I think a center like this is so important, which is why you all can't get rid of me. So I think that can be, very significant. And there are significant pockets of resistance right now against the current administration. So I think that's important as well, that, there's a lot of backlash and there's a lot of resistance against many of the policies and a lot of the rhetoric. From my perspective, I didn't necessarily go into my work on the Holocaust thinking that there would be so many of these timely parallels and connections, but unfortunately I see it all the time. And as I was looking at particularly the American response to the 1930s and the common rhetoric regarding immigrants and things like that, I couldn't help but notice that parallel in terms of a lot of the same rhetoric that we're hearing today, which obviously makes me very disheartened and concerned as an American citizen, but just more generally as a humanist. So, beyond that, I'm sorry I don't have anything more positive to say about our current political climate.
What you said about the indifference of other countries. There was an exhibit at the Marissa, but there was an exhibit at the Glen Cove Holocaust Center about the Harari, some tribe in Africa, that the Germans did exactly what they did to the Jews. They did that to this tribe and waited. I think it was 1919. And nobody did anything. And they said, well, that's like a green light. I was particularly, on another thing, you may have noticed I was taking lots of notes. I was particularly struck by your comments on the individual responding, but the group didn't.
Right, yeah.
My mother's uncles, maternal uncles, were both caught in Berlin in the Kristallnacht. One subsequently died three weeks later from his injuries. The other emigrated to Palestine. But my mother and her sister, when they were crossing a field from their forced labor to get back to town, were stopped by two peasants. Don't go back to the town, there's blood running in the streets. Wow. So the one-on-one, face-to-face,
absolutely,
they stopped. What can we therefore do if we wanted to provoke more sensitization instead of desensitization, which means that we'd have to get away from the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, if we look at the, thank you for those comments and questions. I think part of it is we want to look at what kind of values are being transmitted in our culture and what kind of institutions do we have in place today. And unfortunately, I would argue that we're not really on a systemic macro level in our society promoting empathy or an all-inclusive orientation. An all-inclusive orientation is basically the orientation when you read rescuer responses that virtually all of them had, which is that they don't fall prey to those divisions. They see people as people as people, regardless of whatever superficial markers we could use to divide one another. So I think as individuals, we have to remain really vigilant in recognizing that the media, the administration, Foundation presently, but other really influential institutions in our culture today are promoting a lot of rhetoric that divides us, and that we have to be hypersensitive to resisting those kinds of messages, which is really challenging. I mean, social media is a great example of this. You know, social media does a lot to incite differences and separation rather than promoting that all-inclusiveness. So we have to kind of know what we're up against. And on a grassroots kind of micro level, we can ask ourselves, what can I do in terms of in my own community or within my own life to try to better promote the other side of that, which is kindness, which is treating everyone with decency, for instance, which is not kind of falling prey to those divisions. And by the way, that also means continuing to have conversations and discussions with people who might have different political ideologies or sentiments today, which I know is really challenging. But that's part of the strategy of totalitarian regimes, is they want citizens to start feeling the futility of interactions with different-minded people. They want us to give up. They want us to demonize those people that have different attitudes. So then we become apathetic and we stop kind of collectively identifying all the ways that we're similar, because we are all far more similar than we are different, right? But right now, if you look at our institutions, and again, especially social media, they're really fomenting and demonstrating our differences more than our similarities. And it's very tempting to kind of fall into that type of thinking. Sure.
I wanted to ask you some questions.
Sure.
One has to do with what triggered your research into Holocaust education. Number two, are you teaching Holocaust education at Queensborough? What the responses you're getting from the diversity of the population. And something to add, 6 months after Kristallnacht, you had to ship to St. Louis.
Yeah.
With 913 refugees coming, and it was headlines in the New York Times.
Yeah.
But what happened is you had Canada, America, Mexico, Central America, South America. How difficult would it have been for each of the countries to absorb a handful of those immigrants? And the fact that the ship went back to Germany, it also gave a message to Hitler that the world
absolutely.
doesn't care.
You know, the St. Louis, there was an event. We had one of the scholars from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC several semesters ago gave a talk about the St. Louis. They engaged in a large-scale research project to try to track down what ended up happening to all the passengers of the St. Louis. So we had that talk, was it at least a year ago here at the center? But it was really fascinating. But yeah, that was unfortunately another demonstration of non-action on the part of our government here. And there were people jumping off the ship. There were suicide attempts because they were idle and they were waiting for somewhere to go. I do not specifically teach a Holocaust course here at QCC. I'm in the social sciences department, so I teach psychology and 200-level courses. In my social psychology class, we have a unit on mass violence and genocide, and so we talk about the Holocaust within that context. In my intro classes, we talk about the Holocaust from the perspective of Nazi medical studies, when we talk about research methods and ethics and things like that. In terms of my own trajectory as a social psychologist, I was just always interested in understanding why people did what they did. And I had the benefit in terms of my own education. I grew up in an area in the a suburb of Maryland that had a very strong Jewish population, and so I grew up in an area where I was exposed to Holocaust education early on in my own, like middle school, high school, that type of thing. You know, I had access to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. I've worked with them, and so it was always kind of a part of my own education. And once I pursued social psychology as a graduate student, that's like the ultimate why for me in terms of trying to understand. And you know, I was at another event and I was talking to one of the participants afterwards, and I was saying, you know, not just as a psychologist, but just also as a humanist, I always had this sense of if I can try to explain how something like this could happen, that I would tap into some deeper meaning or purpose. And of course, you know, for those of us who study the Holocaust, you know, the more that you study it, the more that you realize you'll never be able to answer that question. So it's like the ultimate why that you'll never be able to answer. But I hope through my work that I'm able to expose students to this and draw some lessons that they can apply to their lives today. So that's my kind of aspiration, if you will.
I wanted to ask you a question, because we've seen through history that anti-Semitism from pogroms in London, in Kent, and also has raised its head numerous times. And as Hitler used the Jews as scapegoats and also provided propaganda to say, listen, your problem and your problem is because of these people. And that makes it much easier because then I don't have any vested interest because you're the cause of it. Now, they had where Hitler had his youth corps. And making a parallel with this, in the Middle East, they teach children the Jew, Israel, the big... Now, once someone is programmed at an early age to have this, let's say, moral compass established, and also for them, like in Germany, they killed a Jew because a Jew was like a cockroach. They went home, they loved their kids, whatever. Once someone is programmed that way, can they be reclaimed?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know, there's evidence of this here in the States. There are individuals from a very early age that were indoctrinated into white nationalism or neo-Nazi movements here in the United States that got out of it, and that have published memoirs, that have started anti-hate groups, for instance.
It's a minority.
It is a minority, and you mentioned, because one important aspect of it is when are you exposed to it? You know, Hitler Youth was very critical to Nazi policy. They're quoted as saying, those who have the youth have the future. The idea is that if you indoctrinate them early enough, because you know, the younger you are, the more of a sponge you are, the more susceptible you are to that type of rhetoric. And you saw, even in the aftermath of the Second World War, even in the aftermath of all the atrocities of the Holocaust coming to light, the younger an individual was when they were living in Nazi Germany or Nazi-occupied territories, the more ingrained their anti-Semitism and their pro-Nazi stance was, even years removed from the war. So it is very, very hard to reverse that kind of indoctrination, especially when it's transmitted on that societal or cultural level. I mean, the Nazi regime infiltrated education, it infiltrated medicine, it infiltrated media. Basically, every powerful institution that plays a formative role in socializing individuals was promoting the Nazi agenda. So that becomes really, really challenging to resist. It is possible, but you have to be hyper-vigilant, and you have to put in place alternative value systems within those same institutions.
And taking into consideration, you have a whole group of people. And because as you said, I was listening to a documentary where there was a gentleman who was in Pittsburgh Youth. And as you said, and he was older, and he said, you know, it was very, very difficult. He was in his 80s. He said to break these truths, supposedly, that I was taught. And we see that even now, you know, like if I was brought up when my mother said there's good and bad in every race, religion, and creed. So I looked at a person as a person. But now you go into, let's say, another household where you hear derogatory terms, whether it's against a black, white, a Jew, you know, as far as that. And you see that the offspring still have that prejudice.
You know, it's interesting, when I've read cases of Americans who were indoctrinated in white supremacist groups here that got out of it and they were re-educated in a better way. One of the things that these survivors would report is that it was almost like an addiction, that even after they had been socialized in another way, they still a lot of times would experience events that would trigger, hateful thinking or prejudices about whatever the group was. And it was almost like a cognitive reframing where then they would have to identify, okay, this was part of my indoctrination, and then they would have to offer internally an alternative attitude to kind of replace that hateful attitude. So, but it was interesting the way that they described it is it's like being addicted to a substance, right? Where there are times where the craving is triggered or that negative prejudice is triggered, but then you combat that with your newer training that identifies that that was not the right way to see the world, for instance. So it's this like constant vigilance, it's this constant retraining in terms of how you think about groups. So yeah, it is very challenging.
Can that be compared to cults?
Absolutely. And there was a cult-like obsession with Hitler, right? If you look at the rallies and things like that, the psychology of it, a lot of it comes from a need to belong. The need to belong is very, very strong, and it's wired in all of us as social beings. And what happens is that is it's distorted in the case of totalitarian regimes, right? It's a perversity of that need to belong if we look at the psychology of cults or gangs or things like that. But the underlying kind of motivators behind those types of group affiliations are the same, as other connections that we might have, which aren't negative like that. And that's the point where I was saying we're all more similar than we are different, right? It's just a kind of a distortion of those basic needs that all of us have. And there's a reason why certain types of individuals who've been historically marginalized, who feel like they're being forgotten, who are struggling, there's a reason why certain groups are more susceptible to indoctrination for hate than other groups, for instance, because there's something lacking in their own lives, there's something lacking in their own backgrounds that make them vulnerable to that type of rhetoric. And you see that even among terrorists groups, for instance. Yeah, absolutely. You see that among terrorist groups today as well, that oftentimes it is these individuals that have been marginalized, that have been treated poorly, that don't have that connection to their families or larger communities, that can be radicalized online. So in that regard, I think that there is potentially a way that we can even try and empathize or understand how those weaknesses are being exploited and used for this larger purpose in terms of those organizations. Hey.
Sort of touching on what you just spoke, and relating to the continuum of bystander behavior. You began with complacency. I find it fascinating, in a strange kind of way, that there are people that actually work against their own best interests.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Bringing that in relationship to today, like somebody who's an immigrant, for example, voting for somebody who's against immigration and things like that. So what is the psychology of that?
Well, there's a lot behind that. Part of it has to do with rhetoric, right? So there are things that leaders in power are claiming to stand for or claiming that they'll do when they're placed in positions of power. And then there's the reality of what they're actually doing behind the scenes, right? And so a lot of times there's that disconnect because where you're getting your information from can significantly shape how you look at the current administration. So individuals don't always acknowledge that they are behaving in a way that's contrary to their own interests, depending on where they're getting their information from. So that's why freedom of the press, accuracy of what the press is reporting, investigative journalism, all those pillars of democracy which are under threat right now, that's why they're so critical. There was recently, after one of the CNN reporters was ousted from access to the Trump press room, there was a doctored video that Sarah Huckabee Sanders put up that made it appear as if he had assaulted a woman when in fact he didn't. So we're now living in an era where the administration is significantly distorting basic information and access to what we're hearing. So depending on what your political leaning is, you're turning to different sources, and so we have a very different reality, you know, that we're competing against right now.
Victoria's going to say something on that side.
You're like me.
Thank you very much, because this was so fascinating. I'd love to have another hours upon hours.
Oh, thank you.
Have you published your results from this that's public, that's available to the general public?
Yeah, so work in progress, yes and no. I published many years ago, my first book was about the psychology of aggression, and the second to last chapter includes Holocaust-related and more generally genocide-related mechanisms that drive these forms of violence. More recently, and I think we might have flyers somewhere about the Amy Travers book. So there's a book that came out recently. Many of those of us who are here at QCC that have participated or been scholars in resident, a former scholar in a resident, Dr. Traver, and our former director here at the Holocaust Center, Dan Lashem, they edited a book about Holocaust education in community college environments. And one of the chapters is mine, and it talks about basically how I exposed my students to the Holocaust in the context of a social psychology class. I am currently working on a book about bystander behavior as part of my former scholar in residency, which is why they can't get rid of me, because I'm always writing in here. That is not yet available, but I am working on that. I also write for Psychology Today online, so if you look me up, I have a blog. I don't always write about Holocaust-related stuff there. In fact, most of the time I don't. But I have written and published online there about Holocaust education and those types of things. So you can find some stuff if you look a little bit. I thought there was a gentleman over here, and you're welcome to come to my classes. Absolutely. Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh. I know the Squirrel Hill area very well. I've never been to Tree of Life, but I know people who used to belong to it.
Okay.
I even know people who lost family members and friends over there. I just wanted to hear your comments about the bystander reaction in Pittsburgh as opposed to Kristallnacht, because the cops did run in, the ambulances did respond.
Absolutely.
And so it was very different than what we know. The Pittsburgh Penguins, I believe, raised $350,000 to help the community. There, I have a very, very close friend who lives there. They're talking about either knocking it down and building a garden. They're really in discussions. They don't know what they're going to do. And
you know, obviously, what happened in Pittsburgh was very different. It was not a coordinated attack that was based on, you know, some kind of plan by this administration. So, you know, in the aftermath of that attack, I think there are a lot of signs of hope to the extent of how the community responded. And it was not just the Jewish community. There were a lot of other religious organizations, including Muslim groups, for instance, other religious groups that offered their solidarity, started fundraising, participated in vigils and things like that. So there are a lot of reasons for hope, despite what is happening in our culture today in terms of that reaction in the aftermath. So thankfully, in that regard, we're in a very different time than the 1930s in terms of what happened. And thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's also important to acknowledge.
I just wanted to add one other comment about something else that came up.
Yeah.
We're talking about indoctrination.
Yeah.
If you look at the books and the media in the Palestinian areas, they refer to Israelis as, well, this was Farrakhan, but he said this when he was out in the Middle East: termites, cockroaches, monkeys, descended from pigs.
And that dehumanization is actually one of the specific steps on that process of genocide, is dehumanizing the target group. If you look at this administration referring to that caravan of migrants as an infestation, as a contagion, all of that very, very similar, disturbingly dehumanized rhetoric that should kind of elicit red flags for all of us who are steeped in this kind of stuff. Yeah, thank you for adding that.
Okay. I'd like to say that when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we have to bring up the publication, The Elders of the Protocols of Zion. This has been entrenched in the minds of many of the non-Jewish people that there is a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And the Arab countries to this day keep putting this in front of the people. The thing that I'm really worried about right now, because we're living in 2018, I'm the president of a Jewish center right here in Flushing, a small Orthodox shul. Here we are in 2018, and we're living in fear. We here in America, as Jews, have to be afraid to wear a yarmulke in the streets. I'm very, very disturbed at what's going on in the colleges around the United States. A lot of the young people, they're indifferent. They're taking a certain position against Israel. Our only place where we can go, God forbid we have a problem, whether you like Trump or you don't, 80% of the Israelis are for Trump. Okay, we're not going to get too much into it, but at least he had the chutzpah to move our embassy, okay? Look, this is what happens. This is what happens when a person wants to give a viewpoint. You shout us down. You have to remember that during the Second World War, there was one group that went to President Roosevelt, 300 rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, I might add, went to Roosevelt to tell him what was going on. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt at that time was told by the rabbi at the time, what was his name again? Rabbi Stephen Wise. He was warned not to talk to these Jewish rabbis. This was right before Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. They came to tell him in peace, and Rabbi Wise said to President Roosevelt, don't meet with these Jews. Don't let America think we went to war to save the Jews. Is that correct?
Yeah, can I just offer maybe a little bit of an alternative to what you're saying, just from the perspective of I don't necessarily disagree with Trump's policy or whatever support you're saying he has in Israel, but I would also caution that you can't just look at those aspects of Trump policy that you yourself might be benefiting from or that your group might be benefiting from. You want to look at the totality of what the administration is representing. And I think that that's a really significant piece, because maybe right now he's an advocate for certain groups that you might benefit from, but other policies suggest that in the same way that he's turned against other groups, he's also very capable of turning against particular groups that you might have more sympathy towards. So that's something to keep in mind. Beyond that, I don't have very strong feelings in terms of foreign policy there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. To repeat many of the comments that have already been made with less brevity, I'm so jealous of your students.
Oh, thank you. At least one of them are here. You can talk to her.
But I'm going to have to settle for reading your next book, and I look forward to it. There's so many aspects that you've brought out, and these lovely questions have brought out for me. Thank you, and thank you all.
You're welcome.
I have to focus just on one of them. Your discussion of compassion fatigue and the ability of the human brain to take in the individual rather than the group makes me think of another area of interest that I have, which is the medical and the risk assessment field. It's well cataloged that the human brain also has a binary function in risk assessment. Magnitude of risk is difficult for all of us to assess. Who has not been nervous with a bump in an airplane compared to a close call in the car? That's well recorded in the literature, but we all feel, because we're driving the car, that it's less risky. What risk assessment is a developed field what analogies have been made in the compassion fatigue area. It essentially duplicates a question that I've heard earlier. What methods do we have that are effective? What methods have been studied to help all of us overcome this compassion fatigue effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the fact that all of us as social beings, we have this conflict in terms of selfish motivators or motivators of self-interest versus altruistic motivators and motivators towards our fellow man. And so I look at the, collapse of compassion as really being what individuals do when they feel overwhelmed by those in need, kind of for their own survival. And to a certain extent, you could argue that there's an evolutionary kind of side to that, in that sometimes in order to survive, we have to put our needs ahead of those of others, right? But there's an equally compelling argument to be made that community and cooperation historically is also critical to our survival. So there's oftentimes this false notion that selfishness is a trait that is part of our evolution or part of this underlying survival mechanism, but cooperation is equally significant for our survival because we wouldn't really survive without others. And one of the things that I would mention, which I always think is a fascinating discovery in brain research that also shows we're more wired for empathy than we're oftentimes given credit for, is the discovery of mirror neurons. I don't know if you're familiar with this research, but the discovery of mirror neurons actually identifies that. So we have these 100 billions of neurons. They're the brain cells that enable basic communication and everything that we're able to do in one way or another. The vessel for consciousness is the brain. Mirror neurons are a subset of these billions of neurons that can't tell the difference between when I'm doing something versus when I watch someone else doing something. This subset of neurons fires when I watch you doing something as if me, myself, is doing it. And this was a fascinating discovery in research, and it really identifies that on a cellular biological level, we're actually wired for empathy, which I think is oftentimes ignored when we think about our history. So that is something hopeful to look at, the fact that we do have within all of us this wiring to connect to others socially, and then we need to look and see, in terms of our nurture or environment, what can we do to further cultivate or develop that mirror neuron system. But from a biological perspective, there are a lot of hopeful things that we can point to. You're right, in terms of risk assessment, we're not very effective at assessing risks, and we're not always particularly accurate, and that obviously can also work against us in terms of helping people around us. But actually, interestingly, a lot of times what predicts whether or not we'll help a stranger is not necessarily perceptions of our own risk. It's things like, do I feel personally accountable? Do I feel like it's my job to help? And also, do I know how to help? So a big part of, if we want to cultivate greater helping behaviors, is restoring a sense of personal responsibility towards others and seeing if we can socialize people. Going back to that comment I said, that quote, we're not all guilty, but we're all responsible. So what can we do to further cultivate a sense of responsibility, not just towards myself and my family, but more generally towards everyone I'm encountering?
Anti-Semitism on the internet. Where does free speech and hate speech start? Yeah. How do you?
That's really hard to answer. That's a very philosophically profound question. A lot of the research today looks at incitement to genocide, and incitement research is looking at the role that rhetoric and language plays in enabling acts of violence. So I don't know if I'm qualified to draw that line, but I would say that the line is related to the extent to which, if people are being threatened or if you see actual lives that are at stake. But yeah, again, at the same time, it's a slippery slope, especially in this country. We always kind of fall on the side of freedom of speech. Even in the case of hate speech, it's kind of embedded in the legacy in terms of our Constitution. So you also see that our policy towards the internet and our policy towards social media and monitoring language and use is very different in Europe and in other countries. And a lot of that has to do with the critical role that freedom of speech plays in terms of our Constitution. But it's a great question. I would say when the incitement is likely to offer harm, but it's hard to know, it's hard to predict that, because there's a lot of people that troll on the internet, but the trolling doesn't go beyond whatever they're saying in those spaces. And then there's those who are engaging in hate speech that then end up actually, being active. I think another thing that we can look at is, are there access to weapons and things like that that you can use to actually follow through with threats that you're making online? That's another thing that we can look at in terms of our culture that's different from other societies today.
Okay, I think we can maybe take one more question.
I have a question about indoctrination, really. I read yesterday, I think, or maybe before, a few days before, about how Adolf Eichmann had 3 sons. Two of the sons, to this day, are ardent Nazis.
Yeah.
The third one renounced his father and said basically he's a monster. How do you do that? I mean, they've both been indoctrinated the same. How is it that one became anti-Nazi and the other two are ardent?
I would question the authenticity of the anti-Nazi son also. Is that sincere or is just a PR move, right?
He has statements to that effect.
No, that's a great question. And I think a lot of it has to do with how many of the influences in the person's life is reinforcing the same value system? So maybe that particular son that disobeyed or went against the indoctrination process of his other brothers, maybe he had other relationships that offered an alternative narrative. Maybe he dug deeper in terms of the extent of his father's crimes. Maybe personality-wise, he had certain features that distinguished him from his other 2 siblings. That's a really good question. Again, to return to my frame of reference is, I've read cases of former white nationalists here in the state, and those who did end up reforming, one of the things that they would say is that there was always a voice inside of them, even as they were being indoctrinated with hate and with ideology regarding racism and things like that, that kind of questioned or doubted what they were being exposed to. And that certain interactions within their environment or when they went online and that type of thing further enabled doubt. And once that doubt seeped in, a lot of times it grew and became larger, and then relationships with other people who weren't part of that system kind of opened them up to another way of thinking. So I would look and see, was it possible that that one sibling had interactions outside of that indoctrination that for whatever reason the other 2 either didn't have or they were immune to, for instance?
Probably they grew up in the same home.
Right, but I mean, we all know you could grow up in the same home and still have significant differences from your siblings, right? Because we all develop different relationships with our parents. We're all born with different biological predispositions, and once we're socialized outside of the home, we all also have different experiences. So, I don't know the particulars of their histories to say. It would certainly be a fascinating area of inquiry. Thank you for sharing.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. It was wonderful to hear so many questions that we're asking about, like, what can we do today and how can we help kind of be better people? So that's really hopeful and inspiring. Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Dr. Aalai. I just want to remind you again that on Wednesday, December 5th at 12:10 here in the Holocaust Center, we're going to have a panel of 4 Holocaust survivors that were all rescued by the Kindertransport, yes, including Miss Anita Weisbord. I hope you join us. I know it's during the day, during the middle of the week, but we did it on purpose because we really want students to have that opportunity to meet the survivors, but we'll hope you'll join us. There's flyers in the back about it. Have some more refreshments. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.